There is a particular kind of political genius that history rarely gives credit for. Not the genius of the visionary, the man who sees a better future and builds toward it with idealism and conviction. That kind of genius gets statues and speeches and chapters in school textbooks. No. The kind of genius I am talking about is darker, more cunning, and in many ways far more consequential. It is the genius of the man who looks at his enemies, understands what they want more deeply than they understand it themselves, and then gives it to them in a form that destroys them. Otto von Bismarck was that kind of genius. And the story of how he invented the welfare state is one of the most extraordinary acts of political manipulation in the history of democratic governance. Because Bismarck did not create health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions because he believed in them. He did not do it because he cared about the suffering of the German working class, though that suffering was real and severe and thoroughly documented. He did not do it because he had been persuaded by progressive economists or moved by the reports of factory inspectors describing the conditions in which ordinary Germans lived and worked and died. He did it because he was losing. And Otto von Bismarck was constitutionally incapable of accepting defeat. To understand what he built, and why he built it, you have to first understand the world he was trying to control. Because the Germany that emerged from unification in 1871 was not the stable, orderly, disciplined nation that Bismarck had imagined when he spent a decade engineering its creation. It was a nation in the grip of an industrial transformation that was producing wealth at one end of the social scale and misery at the other, and the people at the misery end were beginning to organize. The German working class in the 1870s lived lives that are genuinely difficult to comprehend from the comfort of the present. Factory workers routinely worked 12 to 14-hour days, 6 days a week, in conditions that were dangerous, loud, toxic, and utterly indifferent to their physical well-being. Industrial accidents were common and almost never compensated. Illness meant the loss of income, which in the absence of any savings, meant the rapid descent into destitution. Old age, for those who survived long enough to reach it, was simply poverty with a longer timeline. There was no safety net. There was no insurance. There was no state support of any kind. You worked until you could not work anymore, and then you depended on your family, or charity, or you starved. Into this landscape came the socialists. The Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD, had been growing steadily since its founding in the early 1860s. It was not a revolutionary party in the violent sense, though it drew on the intellectual tradition of Marx and Engels, both of whom were German. It was a party that organized workers, articulated their grievances, gave political form to the anger that was building in the factories and the tenements, and made an increasingly persuasive case that the existing order was not just unjust but structurally incapable of delivering justice. That the problem was not bad employers or bad luck but a system that was working exactly as designed, concentrating wealth upward and distributing misery downward. The SPD's vote share was growing election after election. Its membership was expanding. Its newspapers were read by millions. And in the Reichstag, the German parliament, its representatives were becoming impossible to ignore. Bismarck watched this with a fury that he struggled to contain. He had not unified Germany to hand it to the socialists. He had not outmaneuvered Austria, humiliated France, and managed the Kaiser with infinite patience and skill in order to build a nation that would be dismantled from within by men who wanted to tear down everything he had constructed. The socialists were, in his view, not a political opposition to be negotiated with. They were an existential threat to the German state as he understood it. And he intended to destroy them. His first attempt was blunt and characteristic. In 1878, following 2 assassination attempts on Kaiser Wilhelm, neither of which had anything to do with the SPD, Bismarck used the public mood to push through the anti-socialist laws. These laws banned socialist organizations, meetings, and publications. They allowed the government to expel socialist agitators from their homes. They gave the police sweeping powers to suppress socialist activity of any kind. They were, in essence, an attempt to make the socialist movement illegal and drive it out of existence through pure state power. It did not work. The SPD went underground. It continued to organize. It continued to publish. It found ways around every prohibition that Bismarck threw at it, and when the laws were eventually lifted over a decade later, the party emerged stronger than it had been when the repression began. You cannot, it turns out, legislate away the political consequences of genuine material suffering. As long as the conditions that produced socialism persisted, Socialism would persist with them. Bismarck understood this. Eventually. And when he understood it, he did something that shocked his allies, bewildered his opponents, and changed the world. He decided to steal the socialists' agenda. Not all of it. Not the parts about collective ownership of industry or the redistribution of wealth or the democratization of political power. Those parts Bismarck had no intention of touching. But the parts about the material security of working people. The parts about what happened to you when you got sick, when you had an accident, when you grew too old to work. Those parts, Bismarck calculated, were the fuel that was feeding the socialist fire. Take away the fuel and the fire would die. Give workers enough security that they no longer felt the desperate need for revolutionary change, and the revolutionary movement would lose its reason to exist. It was a calculation so cold, so clinical, so utterly devoid of sentiment that it takes a moment to fully appreciate. Bismarck was not trying to make workers' lives better. He was trying to make them just good enough that they would stop threatening his. The welfare state was not a gift. It was a trap. And it was one of the most consequential traps ever set in the history of political governance. In 1883, Bismarck stood before the Reichstag and made an argument that no conservative politician had ever made before, and that very few have had the nerve to make since. He argued that the state had an obligation to its workers. Not a charitable obligation. Not a moral obligation rooted in Christian compassion or Enlightenment principles of human dignity, though he was not above invoking both when it suited him. A practical obligation. A strategic obligation. The obligation of a government that understood that a worker who had something to lose was a worker who would not burn the system down. The speech was a masterpiece of political cynicism dressed in the language of statesmanship. And the legislation that followed it was, whatever its motivations, genuinely revolutionary. The health insurance law of 1883 was the first. It required that industrial workers be covered by health insurance, with the cost split between employers and employees. If you fell ill, you received medical treatment and a portion of your wages for up to 13 weeks. It was not generous by modern standards. The benefits were modest and the coverage was far from universal. But it was something that had never existed anywhere in the world before. A legal guarantee, enforced by the state, that a working person who became sick would not immediately fall into destitution. The following year brought the accident insurance law. This one was, from Bismarck's perspective, even more important strategically. Industrial accidents were one of the most visible and emotionally powerful grievances of the working class. A man loses his hand in a factory machine, can no longer work, and receives nothing. His family starves. The factory owner faces no consequences. This was not just misery. It was a morality tale that the socialists told over and over again to devastating effect. Bismarck's accident insurance removed that weapon from their hands. Employers were now required to contribute to an insurance fund that compensated workers injured on the job. The state was acknowledging, in law, that the industrial economy created risks that individual workers should not have to bear alone. And then in 1889 came the Old Age and Disability Insurance Law. Pensions. The idea that a worker who had spent a lifetime contributing to the industrial economy was entitled, simply by virtue of that contribution, to a degree of financial support in old age. The retirement age was set at 70, which in an era when many workers did not survive that long was admittedly more symbolic than practical. But the principle it established was not symbolic at all. It was radical. It said that the relationship between the individual and the state did not end when the individual's productive working life ended. That citizenship carried with it certain guarantees that persisted through illness, injury, and old age. Taken together, these three laws constituted something that had no precedent in human history. A systematic, legislated framework of social insurance. A welfare state. Not as a matter of charity or political concession, but as a permanent feature of the legal relationship between the German state and its citizens. The reaction was extraordinary in its contradictions. Conservative industrialists, who had never been asked before to contribute to their workers' insurance and saw no reason why they should start now, were furious. They lobbied against the laws, argued they would destroy German industry's competitiveness, and predicted economic catastrophe. The catastrophe did not arrive. German industry continued to grow at a rate that made its European competitors deeply nervous. The socialists, the people whose political program Bismarck had just partially legislated into existence, were faced with a genuinely difficult problem. They could not oppose laws that improved the material conditions of the working class. Their entire political identity was built around the proposition that the existing order was incapable of delivering such improvements. Bismarck had just demonstrated that it was capable, which forced the SPD into the uncomfortable position of arguing that the improvements were insufficient, that the motivation was cynical, and that the system still needed to be fundamentally transformed. All of which was true. But it was a harder argument to make when workers were receiving medical treatment and accident compensation that they had never had before. Bismarck watched the socialists struggle with this and felt something close to satisfaction. But the story did not end where Bismarck intended it to end. Because the trap he had set did not spring the way he had designed it. The welfare state did not destroy the socialist movement. It did not produce a generation of German workers who were so grateful to the Bismarckian state that they abandoned their political radicalism and became contented conservatives. What it produced instead was something far more interesting and far more consequential. It produced a template. Within a decade of Bismarck's social insurance laws, governments across Europe were looking at what Germany had done and asking themselves whether they needed something similar. Not necessarily because they shared Bismarck's cynical motivations, though some of them did. But because the industrial economy was producing the same social pressures everywhere, the same suffering, the same anger, the same growing socialist movements, and the German model offered a way of managing those pressures that did not require either ignoring them or surrendering to revolutionary politics. Denmark introduced accident insurance in 1898. Austria expanded its social insurance system along German lines. Britain, after decades of political resistance, began moving toward its own welfare state framework with the liberal reforms of 1906 to 1914, explicitly citing the German model as both inspiration and competitive threat. The argument made in the British Parliament was not primarily humanitarian. It was strategic. Germany's workers were healthier, more secure and more productive than Britain's. If Britain wanted to remain competitive, it needed to invest in its workforce in the same way Germany had. The irony deepens the further you follow it. Because the welfare state that Bismarck built as a weapon against socialism became, over the course of the 20th century, one of socialism's greatest achievements. The social democratic parties of Europe, the direct descendants of the movement Bismarck had been trying to destroy, adopted the welfare state as the centerpiece of their political program. They expanded it, deepened it, made it more generous, extended it to more people. They took the cynical minimum that Bismarck had offered and turned it into something approaching the comprehensive social contract that the original socialists had been demanding all along. Bismarck had intended to give workers just enough to make them stop wanting more. Instead, he gave them a taste of what was possible and created the political appetite for everything that followed. There is a question that sits underneath this entire story, and it is one that politicians, economists and philosophers have been arguing about ever since Bismarck first put pen to legislation in 1883. It is not a comfortable question, and it does not have a clean answer. But it is worth asking directly, because the answer you give to it shapes almost everything else you believe about the relationship between the state and the individual. Does it matter why a good thing was done, if the thing itself was good? Bismarck's motivations were not noble. We have established that thoroughly. He was not moved by the suffering of the German working class. He was not acting on principle. He was acting on calculation, on the cold strategic logic of a man who had identified a threat to his power and was neutralizing it by the most efficient means available. The welfare state was, in his hands, an instrument of political control dressed in the language of social progress. And yet, the worker who received medical treatment under the 1883 health insurance law was not less healed because the man who created the law despised his politics. The family that received accident compensation after losing their breadwinner to an industrial injury was not less saved because Bismarck's primary concern was vote share rather than their suffering. The elderly worker who received a pension under the 1889 law, however modest, was not less protected because the architect of that protection had never particularly wanted him to be protected at all. The outcomes were real. The motivations were cynical. Both of these things are true simultaneously. And the tension between them is not just a historical curiosity. It is a live philosophical question about the nature of political progress and how it actually happens in the real world, as opposed to how we prefer to imagine it happens. We like to tell ourselves that progress is driven by visionaries. By people of principle who see injustice clearly, articulate it compellingly, and persuade their fellow citizens to choose a better path. And sometimes, occasionally, that is how it works. But far more often, if you look honestly at the history of social reform, you find something considerably messier. You find progress happening as a byproduct of political self-interest. You find improvements in the lives of ordinary people emerging not from the goodwill of the powerful but from the calculations of the powerful about what they needed to concede in order to preserve what they had. You find Bismarck. This is not a counsel of despair. It is, if anything, a counsel of realism. Because if you understand that social progress often comes from the self-interest of elites rather than their conscience, you understand something important about how to produce more of it. You understand that the most effective lever is not moral persuasion but political pressure. That the welfare state did not arrive because Bismarck suddenly developed a conscience. It arrived because the socialist movement had made the alternative to the welfare state look sufficiently threatening that a man of Bismarck's intelligence chose to build it rather than face the consequences of not building it. August Bebel, the socialist leader who spent years as Bismarck's most formidable parliamentary opponent, understood this perfectly. He did not celebrate Bismarck's social insurance laws as a victory, but he understood what they represented. They represented the system acknowledging, under pressure, that it had obligations it had previously refused to recognize. And every acknowledgement of that kind, however grudging, however minimal, however cynically motivated, was a foundation on which more could be built. Bebel was right. The three modest laws that Bismarck passed between 1883 and 1889 were the foundation on which the entire architecture of the modern welfare state was eventually constructed. Not just in Germany, though Germany's own system grew dramatically more comprehensive in the decades that followed, but across the developed world. The National Health Service in Britain, Social Security in the United States, the pension systems of Scandinavia, the unemployment insurance frameworks of France and the Netherlands, the comprehensive social protection systems that today cover billions of people across dozens of countries. All of them trace their intellectual and legislative lineage back to the same source. Three laws passed by a man who would have been appalled by what they eventually became. The German Civil Code of 1900, which followed Bismarck's social legislation and unified German private law into a single comprehensive framework, extended this transformation into every corner of legal life. Contract law, property law, family law, the rights and obligations of citizens in their relationships with each other and with the state, all codified, systematized and made consistent across a nation that had previously been governed by a bewildering patchwork of local legal traditions. The code was so rigorously constructed, so logically organized, so carefully attentive to every possible contingency, that it became a model for legal systems across the world. Japan adopted it as the basis for its modern legal code. Much of East Asia followed. Large portions of Latin American law derived from it. The German legal mind, applied to the problem of organizing an entire civilization's rules for living together, produced something that the world recognized as genuinely superior and chose to adopt. Law, at its best, is the codification of a society's values. It is the answer a civilization gives, in binding and enforceable language, to the question of what we owe each other. The Germany of the late 19th century gave a complicated and contradictory answer to that question. It said, through Bismarck's social legislation, that the state owed its workers a minimum of security against the worst that industrial life could do to them. It said, through the Civil Code, that citizens owed each other the predictability and fairness of a unified legal framework. It said, through the structure of its institutions, that the relationship between the powerful and the powerless was governed by rules that even the powerful had to follow. None of this made Germany a just society in any complete sense. The same legal system that provided health insurance to factory workers denied full political rights to women. The same state that paid pensions to elderly workers suppressed political dissent with a heavy hand. The same Bismarck who built the welfare state also manipulated elections, bullied the press and governed with an authoritarianism that sat in deep tension with the progressive legislation he passed. History does not deal in pure heroes or pure villains. It deals in complicated people making decisions within complicated systems, and the outcomes are almost never what anyone intended. But sit with this for a moment before we close. The next time you visit a doctor and do not have to choose between your health and your bank account, there is a thread that runs back to 1883 and a law passed by a man who cared nothing for your well-being. The next time you receive compensation for an injury sustained at work, There is a thread that runs back to 1884 and a calculation made in a parliamentary chamber in Berlin. The next time you or someone you love receives a pension, a thread runs back to 1889 and the cold political arithmetic of the most cunning statesman of the 19th century. We live, all of us, inside a legal and social architecture that was built by people whose motivations we would not always admire, for purposes we would not always endorse, in a context we can barely imagine from where we stand today. Understanding that architecture, understanding how it was really built rather than how we prefer to think it was built, is not a reason to be cynical about it. It is a reason to take it seriously, to understand what it cost to create, to think carefully about what it would cost to lose. Bismarck set a trap for the socialists and accidentally built the modern world. That is either the darkest joke in political history or the most hopeful thing about how human progress actually works. Possibly both. I will let you decide. If this story made you think differently about where the world you live in actually came from, then share it with someone who needs to hear it. The history of law is not the history of noble ideals handed down from on high. It is the history of power, pressure, calculation, and consequence. And it is far more interesting than anyone told you in school. Subscribe so you do not miss the rest of this series. Drop a comment below telling me whether you think Bismarck was a villain who accidentally did good, or a genius who understood that doing good and doing cynical were not always different things. I read every single one.